coastal town for the day. Somewhere we had been many times before, at least 3 to 4 times a year. And that's because we've got family who lives there. Ever since my mum was a child, we've always travelled the same route through the countryside rather than the motorway because we like to stop off at what we call a halfway house to grab a sandwich on the way there and a drink on the way back. We have always done this and have always enjoyed it. On this particular day though, everything was normal. We had driven to the coast, we had stopped off for a sandwich, the sun was shining, and it was a normal, lovely day. However, on the way back is where things started to get a little weird. We set off mid to late afternoon because we wanted to miss all the evening traffic and to make sure my friend got home at a decent time. Now the journey just felt normal. We travelled on the same roads as we always had, and we were planning to stop off at the usual pub for a drink. In the space of about 5 to 10 minutes, we noticed the weather had really changed. It had gone from being a glorious, warm, sunny day to being grey, overcast, and honestly quite cold. Now we didn't think much of it, and then my mum said, "Oh, I don't know where I am." Confused, we just said that she must have taken a wrong turning, but she was adamant that she had been on the same road for the last 8 miles, a road we had travelled countless times before. We wondered if the road had been altered since the last time we visited, because now none of us recognised the road or the surroundings. We looked for a familiar landmark that would hopefully guide us in the right direction, but there was nothing but fields for miles. We began to notice that the road we were on was very quiet, and we seemed to be the only car driving along it. Nothing had passed us in what seemed like ages. Me and my friend began to get anxious because of how weird this felt, and we were worried about being lost. Now my mum calmed us down and she told us not to worry, and that the next village we drive through will pull over so she can set up a sat-nav. Now, in 2010, phones didn't really have maps or anything yet, not like we do today anyway. Now about 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of houses in the distance, and as we approached, we noticed that there was 2 semi-detached houses, a small farmhouse and a yard, and an old-fashioned level crossing for trains and a pub. My grandma suggested we pull into the pub so my mum could set up her sat-nav and we could have our halfway house drink. She thought that maybe if we did that, it would calm our nerves. So we entered the pub. It was empty, except for an old man in a rocking chair in front of a burning fire. He stopped rocking the chair abruptly and stared at us as we walked in, as if in shock. He was wearing brown work trousers with braces, black boots, a cream shirt with a knitted vest, a flat cap, and he was smoking a pipe. He looked as if he had stepped straight out of 1910. He didn't speak She also looked like she was in shock. We asked if the pub was open due to it being so quiet, and she stuttered, Oh, yes, it is. What can I get you? We all asked for soft drinks. The lady scrambled around getting us the drinks, and then she looked baffled when we tried to pay with bank cards. She used paper and a pencil to add up the cost of our drinks, so we paid with loose change to make it easier for her. To the right of us was a narrow staircase, and down ran a little girl around the age of 7 or 8. She was wearing white tights, brown brogue-like shoes, and a burgundy pinafore style embroidered dress with a hand-knit cardigan, and her hair was in ringlets. She gasped and also looked surprised to see us, and she looked between us and the lady behind the bar, who was presumably her mother. We thanked them and took the drinks outside to one of the wooden tables. The man in the rocking chair began to rock again and watched us intently as we walked out. We sat down outside and with hushed voices spoke about how weird that whole situation was. We noticed how there wasn't anyone else around. No other cars in the car park, no other people in the pub or beer garden, and no people walking the streets near the houses. The place seemed absolutely deserted, abnormally quiet, and stuck in time. As we quickly finished the drinks, a man in a van pulled up. He got out, got a big axe and a spade out of the back of his van. Then he looked over to us and said, "Oh, visitors," and he went inside the pub. We got back in the car as quickly as possible, and within a matter of minutes we were on a road we all recognized, and the sun was shining once again. The whole thing was just so bizarre and unbelievable. It's all we could talk about for the rest of the journey home. We were trying to just understand the situation, the unrecognizable roads, the old-timey clothes, and the overall feel of the place, and how the people reacted when they saw us, as if we were aliens or something. So that's my story. The memory of it all is still so clear, and I'll never forget the expression on their faces. We still talk about it to this day, 12 years later. All of our memories so clear. It was possibly the most strangest experience of my life, and I feel like I wanted to share my story on here to get others' opinions, and if anyone has experienced anything similar. A very strange experience indeed. I mean, my first, most logical thought for the fact that they looked at them as if they were aliens, completely was a really small community. The original poster says in the story that this little town only had like 2 houses, a pub, a beer garden, and a farm. So obviously it is a tiny, tiny, tiny little town, and they probably don't really get visitors. So that could explain why they were a bit shocked to see, outsiders. But that still doesn't explain why everything looked like it came straight out of the 1900s, like the early 1900s. Why they were dressed like that. Why the woman was baffled when they tried to pay with card. It's all a little strange. The weather suddenly changing. I mean, what was that about as well? That was creepy. And it also seems weird to me in the first place that the mum would have taken a wrong turn in, because she has driven the same route for years on end, always the same roads to this place, because they visit often. So I really don't understand what has happened here. It's so weird to think about that there might be a place somewhere in Yorkshire, England, where time itself has frozen. I think I should head over for a visit. Very, very creepy story. Alright, moving on to the next story. This one was originally posted by a Reddit user called lost_ambition4462. Their story is called When My Grandmother Went to Boarding School in the 50s and 60s. I come from a reservation in South Dakota, and my family loves telling stories from their childhood, so I know all kinds of stories that my grandma told me. She has a lot of good and sometimes strange stories that have happened to her throughout her life. This is one of the stranger stories that she's told me, and it's about when she had to go to boarding school with her sister when she was younger. Now this was in another town called Rosebud. I'm not sure if the school is still there. When she got there to boarding school, the nuns at the school were actually really abusive and liked to mess with my grandma and her sister. Now one night, her and her sister were sleeping with their other peers in a room lined with beds. It was past midnight, and my grandma was awoken by a noise coming from across the room. She couldn't see anything because it was so dark, so she woke up her sister, and they both laid in their beds in fear of what might happen. Then they started to hear the noise of some sort of animal paws and nails scraping across the floor as if it walked towards the beds. Both my grandma and her sister were in shock because there was no dogs or any animals allowed in the building. the stories that she's told me about that place, I don't think I'm ever going to allow my children anywhere near that school. Wow. So, I've also heard stories from my own nun, and it used to be like that, nuns running schools. They were essentially the teachers, but they weren't, they didn't study to be teachers, and they really, really weren't capable of being teachers. Everything that I've ever heard of it was that these nuns were god awful, right? They would just abuse these kids in a million different ways, right? It must have been a horrible, horrible time to be going to school. But for the OP's grandma to think that it was probably one of the nuns who was hiding in a dark corner of their bedroom, making scraping and scratching sounds in a corner to scare them. I mean, for the grandma to think that, that's saying something about just how bad these nuns were. If your immediate thought, just picture it. You're in a dark bedroom with other kids and your sister, and suddenly you get woken up by these really creepy scratching, scraping noises in the corner of the room, and your immediate thought is, that is probably one of the nuns trying to mess with us. That's saying something about the nuns, isn't it? Man, I can see how that must have probably left such a lasting impression on this Redditor's grandma. It clearly did, because she's still telling the story. Damn, that's terrifying. And then we haven't even spoken about the legs without a torso running down the stairs. What is that about, right? Just a pair of legs. I don't know what I have to imagine. Are they severed? Or are they just born as legs? I don't know. It sounds incredibly creepy. That's something I've never heard of before. I think it's probably smart to not go near that door anymore. I wonder if they were severed. I wonder if the nuns had something to do with it. They probably have a few skeletons in their closet. So, we are down to the last story for this evening. Now, this one was originally posted by a Reddit user called moonknuckles. Their story is called An Encounter from My Childhood That Unnerves Me More and More the older I get. I don't know what it was. Ghost. Something similar, cryptid, specifically a cryptid that can mimic human voices in order to lure people places. was around 20 at the time, and a younger brother around 4. One night, it was just the 4 of us in the house, and we were having a Nerf gun war, as one does. Her older brother, he was a good guy, never actually mean or anything, but he did mess with us a lot. And so during the course of our battle, he managed to get the 2 of us outside and then lock all the doors. We had no choice but to stand on the porch and wait for him to decide to let us back in. It was around 11 o'clock at night. Now, the front porch is on the side of the house, within a little alcove. The walkway comes up the side of the house and around a corner. So when you're standing in front of the door, you can't see around that corner. You don't see anything but the side of the neighbor's house directly across from you. It didn't take long at all. Maybe a minute, maybe even just 30 seconds of us standing there waiting. It was actually an incredibly brief span of time. And then, from around the corner, clear as day, as though there's a human being standing within just 10 feet, barely out of sight, what sounds like a voice of a girl around 8 or 9 that says, "Hello, is somebody there? Can you please help me?" My friend and I, we instantly look at each other and we pause for a moment to silently confirm that we had both in fact just heard that. And then we simultaneously start screaming and banging on the front door. The older brother immediately lets us in, asking what the hell is going on, and we blubber an explanation, and then he runs and grabs a kitchen knife and goes outside to check things out. He comes back a few minutes later, says he walked around out in the street and called out asking if anyone was there, if anybody needed help, but nothing. The block was seemingly deserted. And that's it. My friend and I, we spent the rest of the night sitting around just trying to wrap our heads around it. I'd grown up in that neighborhood and I knew every single other kid within several blocks, and there was no 8 to 9-year-old girl that we knew of anywhere nearby. The absolute closest would have been a girl who was 4. But what spooked us the most was just how it sounded. It didn't sound like a distressed child seeking genuine help. To be honest, it really sounded as though somebody was reading it off of a script. The voice was just too calm. I think that's why we both instantly sensed that something was really wrong about the situation. It's like it didn't sound real. We thought maybe it was a ghost trying to mess with us. It's literally all we could come up with at the time, but after that night, we simply never talked about it again. I kinda even mostly forgot about it for a while, but then, years go by and you hear spooky stories of other people's encounters. Things, calling out for help in an off-sounding but close to human voice. And then you see that these things are normally encountered in and around wilderness, and we lived on the literal edge of the neighborhood, where north of us was miles and miles of open field. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Something about this being a child's voice just increases the spooky factor by like 1,000. It's just so much more creepy when it's a child. And then the fact that they were shouting for help. I mean, can you imagine being a 12-year-old standing there on the porch, waiting for your best friend's older brother to decide to let you back in, and then that's what you hear from right around the corner? I mean, that must be chilling, just absolutely chilling. It's also very telling that these kids' first reaction was to scream and to pound on the door, and not once did it cross their minds to try and help this little girl. That just proves to me that something was wrong about that voice. Like the original poster said, it sounded off. It sounded too calm for somebody who needed help. And I think if it had sounded genuine, then maybe those kids would have had the instinct to look and to try and help. I mean, that is properly terrifying. That is the stuff for nightmares. And I am so glad that their first instinct was to pound on the door to get that brother to open up. And I'm very, very glad that they didn't turn that corner and try to help this little girl. Because who knows what would have happened. I mean, it can't have been good. What is a little girl doing up at 11 at night anyways? I mean, the chances of this being a genuine 8 or 9-year-old girl are tiny. Tiny. Wow. I hope this never happens to me. Like, this is something that this would give me nightmares for years to come, honestly. I'm glad that they both stayed safe, and I'm glad that the older brother was still stood there to quickly open that door. Now, sadly, that was it for tonight's scary stories. As always, I want to thank the lovely Redditors who allowed me to share their experiences with you guys on the channel.